Well, ladies and gentlemen, I may as well avail of this pregnant pause which has just settled on the audience to start the afternoon event. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm Gary Morgan. I'm Executive Director of the Museum of Texas Tech, and I'm very pleased to see so many of you here who have come before you're going to go to your baseball game, perhaps, to enjoy what I'm sure will be a very, very interesting talk and discussion to follow. We've got three parts to the afternoon's event. First, we start with a talk from our guest speaker. We'll follow that with a roundtable discussion, and that discussion will rely heavily on audience involvement, so we really want you to be part of that. And we'll finish with refreshments. So please do stay through to the end of the afternoon and chat amongst each other and with our guest speaker. And cognizant of his origins from the UK, I would just say, I'm sure I'm speaking for all of you, that our thoughts and prayers go out to the people of London and the United Kingdom as we think of what they're going through now. Light. What is it? I availed of the Oxford English Dictionary in deference to our guest speaker as the source repository for the answer to that question. And it, not surprisingly, gives a lot of definitions of light. Things like natural agent that stimulates sight and makes things visible. Okay. The light of the sun. Things like lamps in the street shed a faint light. It's an example, for example. A light came on in his room, and the list goes on and on and on. Now, looking at that list, I was actually surprised. I'm a scientist by origins. And there was no mention in that definition of electromagnetic radiation, which of course is a form of energy that's all around us and takes many different forms. Radio waves, microwaves, X-rays, gamma rays, they're all electromagnetic radiation. Sunlight is one form of electromagnetic radiation, but visible light is only one small part of the spectrum there. So you have infrared, for example, and ultraviolet, which we can't see, but they're all part of this light. They're all part of electromagnetic radiation, but that wasn't part of the Oxford definition. I think that is interesting. But we certainly know that light illuminates. Without it, for us humans at least, it's very hard for us to function. The world would have almost biblical pre-Genesis type of attributes to it. Remember the quote. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light, and God saw that light was good. So again, light manifests the concepts of form and lack of form. To have light is manifestly good. To lack light is, in contrast, seen as bad. So it's many things. Light is a need. We need light to see. Light is a scientific property with a scientific cause. Light is used by all sorts of organisms, including the plants, to photosynthesize, without which the rest of life on this planet would be impossible. And it can be seen to have a religious or spiritual origin and significance. A symbol of the movement from nothing to something, from the formless to the form. And light can also be art. I am delighted to be introducing our guest speaker today. He's been on a whistle-stop tour of several countries, and we are very fortunate that he could include West Texas on this visit. Bruce Munro has established his international reputation in art through his creative manipulation of and engagement with light. In a career spanning over 30 years, he's explored light in art and in its connections with music, literature, science, and the human condition. Bruce is English by background, but he's worked all around the world, and including a several-year stint in Australia, where Sydney was his home. And I know that art isn't his only interest, rugby is right up there as well. And quite rightly so. I mean, many of you, I'm sure, will agree and endorse the opinion that rugby is the sport played in heaven, and Bruce and I can certainly concur with that. His works have been shown in many museums and galleries around the world, including places like the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, the Solomon Guggenheim Museum in New York. And his works are held by museums all around the world. But his most monumental works are those which are typically set in the landscape, where art and landscape reinforce each other. And one of those, a very recent project of his, truly monumental project, is the Field of Light at Uluru in Central Australia. For those of you who haven't been able to visit there yet, that is truly a spiritual place, and I know that Bruce will be saying something more on that context in a moment. Here at Texas Tech, Bruce's art is the centrepiece for the main foyer of the new Texas Tech Systems building. And his work there is the Viva Tree. We were just over this morning having a look at it in the context, and it's a knockout. So when you can get the opportunity, insinuate yourself into the Texas Tech building in some way to see it there. It's truly a wonderful piece. And here at the Museum of Texas Tech, we've had his work, Ferryman's Crossing. For those of you who haven't had a chance to see it, do so today. It was originally created for the Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art in Scottsdale, Arizona, and it's been on show here since February. It's in fact closing later this month, so this is your chance to see it if you haven't. And it really has elicited a lot of interest while it's been on display here, and a lot of interest in Bruce Munro more generally. So on that note, I'd say we are very happy to have Bruce join us today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bruce Munro.
Sorry, I thought excuse me, I've got to put this up. Firstly, thank you, Gary, for that very generous introduction. And also thank you to Texas Tech for, first of all, for the wonderful commission and inviting me here. It is always a great joy to be able to come and visit new places, and I've been extremely lucky over the last number of years to get to know some wonderful places in North America. Unfortunately, I can't really give you a scientific connection with light. What I will give you is hopefully an emotional connection with light, because I don't actually have a scientific background at all. I was actually one of three kids, the youngest of three kids, and I'm afraid I was rather academically challenged as a child. I just had long-suffering parents who realised that by putting a paintbrush in my hand and a pencil, that seemed to do the trick. It kept me quiet at least. But my interest in science, funny enough, has grown more and more as I've got older, but in a very general way, because science actually is a great way to understand the world around us. And I think artists are people who want to inquire about life, and science, I realised when I left school and failed all my studies miserably, that I really should have paid better attention at school and not daydreamed quite so much. So what I'm going to do today is to show you a group of works, some work that I've done over the last number of years, and try and give you a little bit of background on why I do what I do, and really try to show you the connection with experience and place. So we start at the beginning, this is where I grew up, in the West Country in the UK. There's a little fishing town called Salcombe in Devon, and I've always felt very close to the water. So as Gary was saying, it's quite extraordinary that in my sort of 30s, I went to Australia, and I've now produced a piece of work that couldn't be further away from the sea. Uluru is probably 1,500 miles, possibly more, in every single direction from the sea. But as I said, I was drawn to the sea, and as a child, I was very keen to try and capture the sea. So I was always sitting on these steps, not these very steps, but steps, drawing and painting and trying to capture the sea in movement. And I did this painting when I was about 8 or 9, and I was very disappointed because it didn't really look like the sea. It was a child's version of the sea. But years later, when I was about 18, and I was studying painting and sculpture as a degree, I realised actually it wasn't too bad a painting. Not in terms of its technical ability, but really what it showed me was the journey I was probably going to take for the rest of my life. And that was actually capturing something about the essence of the sea. And you can really see, and you've probably got children yourselves, or you might have made paintings quite similar, where you struggled to capture something in front of you, but actually the process of making, you would have probably moved the paint around the surface in a sea-like manner. So we're going on a few years here. I went to Sydney, did my art school degree, and ended up going out to Sydney because I had a friend who was living out there, and I was slightly lost to know what I was going to do. So I did all sorts of odd jobs while I was, when I first landed there, and I ended up in an advertising agency trying to get some work called Saatchi & Saatchi. And I took along my sketchbooks, not really knowing anything about advertising, and this chap looked at my sketchbooks and he said, "You're a bit of a butterfly." Now, no young man of 24 likes to be called a butterfly, but I took it in the best sense, and I thought, well, I'm going to just prove him, because he was basically telling me I needed to focus my attention on one thing. And it was just fortunate at that time I'd walked past a window in Sydney, a shop window that had this display of light in it. And I'd been mildly interested in light up to that point, but it really caught my attention. It was a product, it was a fluorescent product, or fluorescent plastic that was irradiated by ultraviolet light. And there was something about that material that really caught my attention. And that was really my first foray into light, which was when I was 25, so that was a fair time ago. So moving on, what I did is I started a little studio in Sydney. I ended up working in a factory, manufacturing. And the great thing is when you're an artist, you need to learn about process, you need to know how to get a job done. So I made it my a rule that I wasn't going to do any art while I was in Sydney or in Australia. I was there for 8 years. So funny enough, a lot of work that I've been doing over the last number of years has all been inspired by those years where I actually didn't do any art at all. I had sketchbooks going, but I on purpose said, because I just felt at that age that I needed some life experience, so I was prepared just to do any job, just to see where it led me. On the way out, and before we left Australia, and we left purely because our parents, my wife's parents and my parents, we were both originally from England, they were getting on a bit, and we hadn't seen our families for 8 years, so we thought actually we should return home. And I had this incredible experience. We went to a place called Uluru. In those days it was known as Ayers Rock. For those who've never been there, it's this huge red sandstone monolith that comes out of the desert. And I was a little bit cynical about going there because all my Aussie mates had said, "Bruce, go to Uluru, it's amazing." Most of them hadn't been there themselves. When I got there, it was absolutely extraordinary. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I wrote in my sketchbook that this place really made me feel alive. It's strange because I don't want to come across as some old hippie, but it really did get into me, and I just needed to express that. And strangely, that experience was notated in my book as a field of light. So I went home, we had 4 children, and I needed to do some proper work to earn some money to keep everybody fed and watered. And I ended up being quite lucky. I started a lighting studio in the UK, basically a one-man band, and then that grew to 2 and then 3. And I managed to get some really rather lovely jobs going around to different countries, lighting buildings mainly initially. But in my spare time, I started to play around with these ideas that I'd had in my sketchbook that I thought nobody would be interested in, but I really thought it would be fun to do. And this was just a fun experiment I did on a beach in the West Indies. So going forward again, this was the journey into Uluru was in 1992, and it took me 12 years to actually create this piece of work. It's called Field of Light, and it was an expression of how I felt, or the experience of visiting Uluru. And we put it in our field at home. Now, we didn't have any money at the time. We had a big mortgage on a house. We bought this really dilapidated old farmhouse with a field. I needed a field because secretly I knew I wanted to experiment. My wife kept on saying, "Why do you need a field?" And I said, "Oh, well, you know, it'd be good for the children to run around in." In fact, that wasn't the truth. It was this Field of Light. And I'm afraid, and my wife's forgiven me, but a certain amount of the mortgage went on making this. She said, "Why haven't we got any curtains, and why aren't the cupboards painted and the carpets in?" And I said, well, we've sort of run out of money. And she said, "Well, what's that in the field?" And I said, "Well, this is this experiment I've been telling you about all these years." Anyway, it proved to be something that I will never do that again, but it proved to be something that I just had to do. Anyway, one experience that really changed my life was, we didn't tell anybody about this. I just had a switchboard outside the house. People would sometimes go walking past our house and say, "What are all those things in the field?" There were about 15,000 of them, sort of amongst the grasses. And I just said, "Look, come back at night." Anyway, a couple of ladies had been several times, and one lady said to me, "Bruce, can I come and see, I've got a friend, she's not very well. Could we drive right up to the edge of the field?" So I said, "Of course you can." Anyway, this lady turned up to the field one night, and she got out of the car and grabbed my hand and said, "Thank you very much," and burst into tears. Now, never ever had I made a piece of work that had such a profound effect on somebody, and I suddenly realised that I'd connected with somebody through the work that I did, and I thought that's what I want to do more of, because I see art as a way to connect people and connect with the world. So very fortunately, this piece of work caught fire, not literally, but it sort of got some interest, and it went around to various museums. And it was this museum, actually, that led to a phone call from a newspaper in Alice Springs, because the museum did there was a narrative on the inspiration, which was obviously Uluru. Alice Springs is a town about 400 kilometres north of Uluru. And this journalist phoned me up, which was quite surreal, getting a phone call from the middle of Australia when you're in England. And she talked to me about it, and then it went live on the local radio. And from there, a gentleman called Ray Stone, who was involved with indigenous tourism out right in the centre of Australia, said, "Look, would you like to come over to Australia?" This was 20 years after I'd left. So of course I said yes, and that was 5 or 6 years ago, and eventually we managed to take the Field of Light to Uluru. In the meantime, it has been to a number of places, and I'm just going to flip through some of these. These are places in the United States, in the UK, St Andrew's Square in Scotland, the Hermitage in, I always forget where these places, everywhere is, Virginia, Atlanta, Desert Botanical, Minnesota. And the point is, I don't just do the Field of Light. That was my one installation that sort of got me started. So I always show it first because it is my sort of touchstone. What this is really is to try and explain to people about where does inspiration come from. Inspiration is many and varied. It will come from whether I'm reading a book or a piece of music or looking at an equation I never understood at school, or somebody talking to me or smiling at me down the street. I never know, and I keep a sketchbook going with me. And just to give you how simple it can be, I was asked to do some work in a botanical garden in Columbus, Ohio, and it was the Franklin Botanical Garden, and there was a desert biome, and I was thinking about deserts, dry deserts, and I've always been fascinated by those, you probably get them here, these vortexes of wind, which they're called chindis, I believe, in Mexico. I don't know what you would call them over here, but it's just a whirlwind or a dust devil, possibly. And I just wanted to do a very simple interpretation of that. So chickens. Chickens have been a form of inspiration for me. I'm just trying to show you what a nutcase I am, really. My wife keeps chickens, and they were getting killed by foxes, and they were becoming very expensive boiled eggs. This local farmer showed me this amazing trick. He took a redundant fluorescent tube, one that had basically been discarded in a skip, 12-volt battery and an electric fencer, and he put the two together, and he managed to get a pop of light every 3 seconds out of these tubes. And I thought this was quite a good trick. So I'm just going to play there should be a, maybe it's the next one, no? What am I doing wrong? Ah. I might need some technical, anybody know how to yeah, that's not the right one.
Go to the next one and go up a little bit.
Okay.
The prompt was go, yeah.
Ah. And I will, thank you. I'm sorry I'm so useless. As you can see, I'm not the technical, I would never get a job as a, there we are. So what's happening is that the tubes are popping every 3 seconds. And I just love the way that you can build a structure, a three-dimensional structure, and at night it can disappear, it can dissolve into something else, and then in the day it becomes a structure again. So these are the sort of tricks that you pick up over this is the sort of thing I might think about at night, whereas somebody else might be thinking about a game of baseball or playing a game of golf. I think about flashing fluorescent tubes. So, you know, as I said, inspiration comes in many different forms. We were living in Australia for 8 years, and I was woken up by these self-crested cockatoos on most mornings. And they look a really attractive bird, but they've got the worst bird call in the world. It really is ear-piercing. And the other wonderful thing about the Aussies is that they have this iconic cultural clothes line that they put in the garden called a Hills hoist, and most families will have one, or they did, not so much nowadays. But I just love it because it's you know, when you can identify certain products with certain times, periods of history. So I put the two together, and I just had this notion. I wondered one day, you know, how many species of cockatoos there were in Australia, and I did a little bit of Googling and found out that there were, I think there were 12 or 13, and I looked them all up, and I thought, oh, I wonder what they sound like. And they've all got equally horrible bird calls. So I kind of thought this would be a rather fun installation to do a sort of an analogy of these birds in an English garden in the winter. So this is what we did. We colour-coded and it's a slight sort of throwback to my ultraviolet days, you know, when I was a kid, first forays into light. So I was using fluorescent plastics. And this is a sound light installation, and just to show that art is a bit of fun, and you can have. My wife and I and a friend, aside from the researching the bird calls, we did our own little bit of an interpretation, and we had a couple of I'd say Jack Daniels, but it wasn't Jack Daniels, just to help us on our sort of, get into the mood of being a cockatoo. That's my wife. So it was only a very short one. So you can have a bit of fun. In a slightly more romantic mood, I'm always looking out of the window, seeing nature unfold, seeing the seasons go by, and we have these bales that one evening I was going for a walk and I noticed these bales sort of glowing, and they, to me, in the twilight, they reminded me of rising moons. And traditionally we used to harvest under a full moon, and I just had this, by swapping the words around, you have a moon harvest as opposed to a harvest moon. I'm very interested in componentry as well. So components, I often make my own components. I mean, today it's so much fun. I wish I'd been born a little bit, not so long ago, because, I mean, they have all these machines now that kids can, what my children are designing on to what I had to design on, it's incredible. So now you can prototype in a day, whereas it would take me a year to do some prototypes. I'm interested in the inanimate object, the way that you can take a single component, what I call a widget, and then by actually amassing it, you can almost recreate your own nature. So this is going back to Sydney days. And again, what I was saying to you earlier, I was worried about this idea of becoming a full-time artist because it is a rather self-indulgent activity, and I wanted to make sure that the work I did was slightly larger than the person, than just me. It had to be about my experience of the world, or something that I felt people could relate to. And because I've been keeping these sketchbooks, I remembered an instance when I was sitting on this beach at the age of 25, away from my family and feeling somewhat, a little bit sad, and missing my friends and family. And I noticed that the sea, the light on the sea over a period of 3 hours, seemed to change my mood from being slightly down in the dumps to at one with the world. Now, I didn't know I was going to create a piece of art about that 40 years later. What I did, though, is I put it in my sketchbook, and this is why I say to youngsters, carry a sketchbook round, write everything down, sketch it, do whatever you do, because you'll never know, that could be real inspiration for future work. So anyway, I was probably in my 40s, and I thought, that might be an interesting thing. I needed to create a sea. And I thought, well, how do I create a sea? I knew by painting it wouldn't do the job. And I then was thinking about sequins. Sequins are those, you see a sequin dress, and it has kind of optics that reminded me of this kind of play of light on the water, or optical effect. And then I thought, well, a CD or a DVD is pretty much like a big sequin. And we had a field of a certain size, and I realized that I needed 1 million CDs. It took me a year to collect them. I actually didn't get up to 1 million. I got up to 600,000. And then I realized, because I'm not that smart, I realized actually if I just actually moved the CDs slightly further apart, I could cover the field. So I didn't need the 600,000, the million. But when I finished this piece of work, it taught me something, working with people. We had 150 people over 3 days. We had barbecues, we had lots of fun, and we created a piece of art together. And this isn't about one man, this is about, I believe art is a process, not for everyone, but personally, where it's rather like, I have an analogy, it's like a cake, and we're all a part of that cake. Many helpers, many people doing different jobs, And actually the people who really complete that cake are the people who come and see it. So it's a very shared experience, and it starts with the idea and it finishes with the last CD when you pick it up off the field. There's a little film here which I will play a little bit of just so you can get the sense of it. Sorry about that. There is a great sense of joy working with lots of people and doing something together. And it sounds mad because a lot of people are going, why are you doing this? And I didn't really understand myself, but and I get my family obviously involved. They're not so. I have to tell you, my children were quite sharp on this because I said I'd pay them £1 a bag to pick all the CDs up, and I worked out it would be 1,000 CDs per bag, and it cost me £1,200. So they managed to find the smallest bag and put 500 CDs in every bag. So these are just really some examples of how inspiration comes up to you. I was invited by the Rothschild estate to do a 5-year residency there, and I was so excited by the prospect of being able to produce work every year for 5 years in these wonderful grounds. I was driving home from that first meeting, and put the radio on. It happened to be a classical station, and this wonderful composer called Rotavara, he's a Finnish composer, I think he's still here, but he was quite contemporary in his time, and I just really loved the music, and it inspired me so much. By the time I got home, I phoned the curator of Waddesdon, the art curator, and I said, I know what I'm going to do on your front lawns. And she said, well, that was quick. It was only about 2 hours since I last saw you. But it was this, I looked this fellow's music up, and the title of the piece that I've been listening to was called Angel of Light. And I just went, that's it. It's going to be a very simple installation. And these things only last, for 3 or 4 weeks, and then you move them. But I just love the way that I'd seen an exhibition, Sotheby's had this exhibition of quite large sculptures on these lawns. We're talking about 250 yards from here to the house, and it's amazing how big spaces swallow up big sculptures. They look slightly small and insignificant. So I realised that actually I needed to do something that actually had scale and also worked with the kind of design of the landscape. Sometimes the landscape itself can inform you. In other words, the topography will actually give you words. So I was walking through here and I was just inspired by the way that the landscape undulated, and it gave me a title. I like experimenting with materials, and I try and I don't see myself falling into any particular category. It's really what's on the menu today. And this is, again, looking back to Rotavara. Now, he wrote this wonderful piece of music, and I won't really try and explain to it, but this piece of work actually here, and I'll play it, is really an interpretation of this piece of music. It's a sound-like piece that hopefully I can explain a little bit. See, what inspired me about his music, it just gave me pictures in my head, and I think that's what happens a lot when you listen to music. And, you know, it doesn't always have to be a literal interpretation, but it can be just things that have connections. And I think daydreaming for me has been quite an important way of creating things, because when I was a child, I was often getting, in those days, the teacher used to throw chalk at you if you weren't paying attention. And often I was looking out of the window. It wasn't really that maybe they weren't that engaging, some of the teachers, but I learned through my life to actually watch my mind, almost like I was outside myself, watching the different things that were going across my mind. And then you see these things that aren't really connected, and you just pull them out and remember them and put them together. And sometimes they make sense, and you can get another kind of language going. So as I said, I was a bit of a slow reader at school, but once I'd caught up, I really did love reading. And this is a very important book for me, Kim by Roger Kipling, because it introduced me, it's my first introduction to Buddhism, in a very small B for Buddhism, but there's this wonderful Lama, maybe some of you remember reading it. It is a beautiful book. Anyway, this was an interpretation of the arrow spring that comes into that book. When I was 21, I worked with this crazy chef who was, I said she was quite crazy. She was an artist, and she gave me this book, which I read in a bedsit when I was a little bit after I'd finished working in this restaurant. And again, it's become, this was, you know, amazing. Years later, I start to make pieces of work about it. And there was a connection here with synesthesia, which is where sound and vision kind of meet. And it was called Water Towers, and Water Towers has become, again, a bit of a favourite, and when I say a favourite, close to my heart, because it was a challenge to do this, to put this together. There were 69 towers, there were 220 bottles, so that's over 16,000 bottles. We had to install this in a cathedral cloister. We had the projectors in each tower were modulated to work with the sound, so that you could actually, each tower would slightly or fluctuate differently. And my joy of this piece is, again, it's using objects that we would think are worthless, and you don't necessarily think of them as an artistic medium. But a plastic bottle, if you think about it, is an incredible product. I mean, it's relatively recently that we've had plastic bottles, but we forget what, we see these things, but we don't see them. When you go into a supermarket and you go shopping, and this is how I actually found them, because originally I was going to make this installation out of a construction, and it was going to cost me thousands of pounds, and I would have never done it. And then I was shopping one day and I saw these bottles and realised the structural integrity of these bottles would allow me to create this piece of work. And there is something, I mean, water in a bottle acts like a lens, so it distorts the reality. So when people walk around it, you lose people and then they appear again. So children's books have been C.S. Lewis. Again, I was introduced those by my cousin. He was much older than me. He was at Cambridge University. He was a clever one, and he introduced me, his young cousin, to these, and I loved reading them. And later on in life, I'd always been slightly amused by a collection of owls. It's called a parliament, and you know, we've got all these stuffy UK politicians, and I just really had to kind of create something that reminded me of them. You get the idea. And again, this is a memory, this is a fairly recent piece, a bit of fun. When I was 16, I joined a poetry club at school because there was a girl I rather fancied and I wanted to get to know her. I was unsuccessful on that and I was unsuccessful on poetry. But we had to learn new words, 3 new words a week, and this was the very first word I learned, radamanthine. And I've never used it since I was 16, and I thought, well, it's about time 40 years later I might use it. So it means lordly and judgely figure. So this is actually a henge of winking owl's eyes. I'm going to spin through some of these because they don't really need that much explanation. Needless to say that design and components has always been of interest. So I found myself a while ago in this wonderful lodge in the Highlands of Scotland, and the client said to me, Bruce, can you create a piece for a particular space on a stairwell? And I was sitting on these granite steps looking out of the window, not knowing what to do, and it started raining, as it does a lot in the north of Scotland, or the Highlands, and the rain was coming down the window, rivulets of water, and the word light shower popped into my brain. Now, it took me a year, because as I was saying earlier, this is a while ago, it took me a year to get the actual components exactly right. And then that evolves into an iteration. This was light shower, we placed this at Salisbury Cathedral. This has been probably one of the most enjoyable experiences of an installation, because every hour for 5 minutes we had to, or I think it was maybe a bit more than that, we had to quietly sit down while a visiting priest would come in and talk to an open congregation. And it's a lovely thing to be made to stop working and just sit quietly while somebody is saying some nice words, and then you start up again. So work evolves, and you do fun things, you do iterations of work, and silly things inspire you. This was a comic strip character. I'm often asked to do pieces of work, or installations, or commission pieces, and I try and get it to fit the character of a space sometimes, or I'm experimenting with materials. This is really for all those who don't have a drawing skill, nor do I, so anybody can do it. Children always inspire me. I had this wonderful memory of my children, this is a while ago now. It was a bucket and spade holiday where you go onto the beach, and I remember holding my eldest daughter's hand. We were shrimping, and the light was coming into these undulations on the beach. And I just felt so happy to be in that space with my daughter. And I thought afterwards, well, I'd love to try and recreate that. And I went back to the beach about 3 months later. They'd actually had mad cow disease at the time, so it was quite difficult getting them to beaches. And anyway, we cast the beach, a section of the beach, in plaster, then went back to a glass studio, and then created, this is an installation called Beach Without Sand. What I really wanted to do, there is actually it's an animated piece, but you can't see it because it's a still, where the light, I wanted to try and recreate that effect of light and cloud going over these little depressions, sand depressions, where we were shrimping. As I said, playing around with materials I love. I went to New York fairly late on in life, probably early 40s, and I was just completely gobsmacked by the verticality of the city. And also being a Brit, particularly my generation, we were brought up on a lot of American film and TV, so I felt when I first went to New York I was actually taking part in a film. It was just incredible, and every time I go back to New York I still feel like that. This is a piece, a slightly sort of Mondrian influence. I do a lot of things on spec just for the fun of it, but this was kind of to try and create a Lilliputian city. It's one of 81 towers, and the idea is that there is a dance analogy with this, and I won't bore you with it, but I'm interested in the written form of dance and the way that you can possibly turn a two-dimensional written form into a three-dimensional vortex, and you actually encapsulate that into a miniature building or a Lilliputian building, and then as the audience you would dance around the buildings. So this is really to show you the generation I came from. We had cassette recorders, black and white tellies, and we didn't have videos in those days, so everything you saw you had to remember. I mean, you know, the kids today are so lucky because they can play their favourite film whenever they want them. We had to go to the cinema and you would see the film and you would just sort of absorb it. And then you'd go home and you would draw as much as you could remember. And then if you were lucky, you might see a book or something that had something to remind you. So this is a slight memory of some silly English films called the Carry On films, which I won't explain. It's a bit like Benny Hill, and I won't explain that either. So this is a piece down in Scottsdale not so long ago, and again, this is a stretch of the canal, and it amused me when they'd asked me to do an installation on the canal, and I was kind of amused because it had no fishing signs all along the canal, so of course I had to do an installation with fishing rods, and I did want to call it no fishing, but they said please don't, so I called it blooms, which I think is a little bit boring, but and this was an inspired piece by the indigenous Indians from that area. I noticed on my walking around the garden that they had this wonderful old ceramic pot nestled between a branch of a tree, and I asked somebody, what is that? And they said, oh, that's what the indigenous Indians used to put in their dwellings with a little bit of water in them, and they act as an air conditioning unit. I thought that was a genius thing. 1,000 years ago, somebody had worked that out. And I guess this is an interpretation. It's sort of almost a reverse of a fire, because you know at night in England what you do is if you're in cold climes, you would sit round a brazier with your hands and do this. Well, in Scottsdale in the middle of the summer, it gets really hot, so I wanted to kind of give them a psychological cooler that they could, and people were actually standing around these having a good old chat across the pots. And this brings you up to about 3 years ago. I came across this South Korean artist called Kim Vanki, and he lived in New York and painted, and I was intrigued by his paintings. I was actually invited to a museum in his name to do some work, and when I got to look at his paintings, and they reminded me of a language. They weren't about language, but they just struck me about language. And this was a very important change of direction for me, because I suddenly realised that I'm working in a medium that obviously has a language of its own, Morse code or semaphore. This is a sort of typical ship-to-ship where two ships could communicate. And I thought about this and then started to experiment using Morse code, and this is the piece that we have in the museum here, the Ferryman's Crossing. This is actually an opposite interpretation, and I'll show you the reason, because instead of actually having the CDs and using the light flashing from above with the message in the light, this is actually using the actual code, dots and dashes, to interpret the language. In a similar way to the piece here, and this is the piece which you have here, is what it's about for me is trying to take the essence of an experience and recreate it, but not in hopefully not in a too literal way, so that you're getting, maybe it's the light quality, the quality of light. I think the quality of light can really take you back to places. This is actually, again, using Morse code in a slightly different way, where we've changed the dots and dashes. This is an interpretation. In fact, I was talking about this with Andy today, about how you can, how many, I think the Inuit have 13 or 14 or maybe more words for snow, so this was just an interpretation of that concept. It was actually a silent piece. It didn't have the sound. It was just a very silent piece, because snow is silent. But each of those interpretations are actually the Inuit expression of snow. And this led me on to, I was invited again to, by Salisbury Cathedral to do a piece. And there is an interest in this one because every line of that radial, they wanted me to be inspired by the star of Bethlehem, and I think I took Matthew chapter 2 verses 1 to 12 and took that, the language from there and turned that into code, and every radial has it. So this actual piece took about an hour to start from a very small spot in the center of the font. What was interesting, we had docents at the cathedral who were looking after the cathedral, and when visitors came in, they were actually reading the code as it came out. Sorry, I won't play them all because you'll go to sleep. So more of my interest in code, in Morse code and this language, has really developed quite a lot. And this is the last piece I'll show you on that in this bit. But this is the piece I did at Bath Spa University. And this is actually, the space itself inspired me because it reminded me, for some reason, of a forest. And so I did this abstraction of a forest. It's, again, has its roots in a C.S. Lewis book. And this is actually the code for C, which is the speed of light. So I was literally drawing light wrapping itself around the trunks of trees as the sun moves across the sky. And there is actually a reflection, because in the book, this particular book, these trees are all in a forest where there are lots of ponds. So I wanted to do the reflection of the tree in the water. and there are more of these which I won't take you to. We'll move through those. And again, this is where we start to get involved in, I feel that all art studios need to kind of be involved somehow to do their bit for charities, help good causes that you believe in. And this was a charity called Shelter Box that we bought a tent for them. It's a first relief charity where you basically they send a tent with everything you need in a disaster area, where there might have been a war or a natural disaster. And I was a bit frustrated that we could only afford one tent. So I thought, well, actually, maybe we can help them in other ways. So I persuaded the people at Wadston Manor, Lord Rothschild, that it would be a good idea if we maybe made an installation about tents, and it's called SOS. What I realised is Morse code, because it's very simple, it can be read sideways as well as above. And it was also, again, my interest in, as a child, when I listened to the radio as a child, we used to flip channels a lot. They had the sort of old radio sets where you could actually, my grandfather had one where you could twiddle the knobs and you could hear France, you could hear Russia, you could hear America, and then suddenly you might hear a bit of Morse code. You'd hear a bit of cricket. So I was trying to create something that brought all these elements together. And a tent.
Irish Sea, westerly or southwesterly, 4 or 5. Stumble to the kitchen, pour myself a cup of ambition.
So we actually had Lord Rothschild dancing around that one. That's when everybody had gone away. But some of his staff told me that he used to take his car up there at night and get out, and, which gives you some great pictures in your mind. So this was the piece that I did at Uluru last year, 2016, and amazingly, they had 130,000 people there. And the first year, and they said, and they've taken it for another year, so we're very pleased about that. The important thing to remind you all now is that this isn't one person, this is a lot of people getting involved. So I couldn't possibly put in 50,000 stems of life into the ground, or make it, or deliver it, or do anything. So I have a very small role in all of this. I have an incredibly skilled team who help me do these things. We have the people who were on the ground there, and the wonderful indigenous people, the Ananu, who allowed me to come and do this. This is a huge, huge honour to be, and I didn't want them to feel that I was imposing something on there, because it is a sacred landscape. All I wanted to try and explain to them that this is how their land inspired a person. And this stands for me for the good things in life. It makes people smile, it brings people together. And I feel at this the way the world is at the moment, we need a lot of that. And we need some positivity in the world. And we need to try and connect each other, feel connected. And one of the things that was a complete surprise for me was when I went to stand in the middle of this field, there is no artificial light in the area, or thousands of miles away from anywhere. And I noticed that the Milky Way actually touched to the side of the field, so that when you stand in the middle of it, you're suspended in a ring of light. Now, I didn't design that, I have to say, but it was a surprise for me. But and again, this is the wonderful thing with installation. There are lots of surprises that you can't imagine. These are, again, going slightly to, to show you that my mind is always moving. And when I came back from Uluru last year, I came back rather depressed. And I came back depressed because I suddenly got the passage of time was passing. I'd been there 25 years ago, and 25 years later, I'm kind of going through my life quite quickly, I feel. And I just thought, oh my God, you know, life is short. And obviously that's not a great, you know, none of us like thinking about that, but you've got to face up to it. And I started to think about it, but I had this wonderful journey with a lady who was a ranger. She was part Aboriginal, around the rock, and she took me on a little guided walk. And she was explaining to me that the indigenous people have this concept of time very different to a Western concept. They see time as one thing. So past, present, and future are a sort of a fusion, as opposed to a linear line. In the West, we think of it past, present, and future. They see it as a holistic whole. And that made me feel much happier, because it made me feel a part of the future and a part of the past. And not so sad, because a lot of people you lose your parents and loved ones and friends, and I just realised that I was still connected with them, and I'm still connected to my children and to people beyond. And so this was a symbol that I wrote. It's a silly thing, but it was my interpretation. It's basically a literal, quite literal in one sense. There's 3 time zones in there. There's past, infinity present, and an infinity future. The lines are actually, you know, the speed of light, and these are called, well, it was called Time and Again, and it was kind of an installation of floating lilies. But it's taking me forward into a completely new place, where I'm starting to explore the idea of place and time, because I think that this is really what defines us. We're all just little moments of place and time. Our lives are just little moments of that, and that's what I really want to go on and explore. And this is the Viva tree at Texas Tech, for anybody who hasn't seen it. And again, this was the start of this language and light. I was really very, very grateful to be able to do a piece of work in this building. I'm just going to go through 1 or 2 more pieces just to give you again, going back to the sense of fun. This is another one we did to help a small charity, and it was a slightly Heath Robinson fun thing we did. That's my old bicycle, and I didn't get a new one. I quite like the idea of getting people, persuading people to get involved in these things, because it's great fun doing it, but you do get a sense of just, well, doing things together en masse and just having a bit of fun and making the art do something for somebody else as well. And this is the last piece. This is a future project, and the reason I put this in, because it's very important to me. It came from a dream. I had this dream. I was working in the same time when I did that light wave, right at the beginning you saw. Around about that time, I was staying there in this lovely place with my wife, and there was this gospel music that floated through the window, and probably it was fueled by a few rum punches, I don't know. But I had a very good sleep that night, and I woke up in the morning and I said to my wife, God, I had the most incredible dream. I was in a building, and it was full of light. It was full of just light, but I don't think there were any windows. And I guess I didn't see a form of the building, but I tried to post-rationalize the dream. And I interpreted that, well, basically that the light was coming somehow into the building through light pipes or light wells. And so I decided that I would visualize that building. So it's actually coming through, the light is coming down through 3 water features, and it comes down through the water, in through what I call light pipes, and it comes into the center of the building via the light pipes you'll see in a minute. And it comes into the building through prisms and then lights the space inside. Now the point of this building, I thought about it long and hard. What is this building for? What could I do? What could I make it about? In 1999 my father died. I was very close to him. And as when I'm sure anybody that's lost a parent knows, it's a very difficult time to go through. But I was helped by this fellow who was a Buddhist practitioner, and he taught me this wonderful meditation called the Metta-bhavana. The Metta-bhavana is called the compassionate meditation. This isn't about any religion, it's just a humanist compassion. There are 5 steps. Bring loving kindness to yourself, bringing loving kindness to a friend or a loved one, bringing loving kindness to an acquaintance, bringing loving kindness to an enemy, bringing loving kindness to the world. And I thought, it took me ages to try and work this meditation out. The worst bit is trying to bring loving kindness to yourself. And then one day I had this realization that I was once a child, like my own children. So what I did is I started to imagine myself as a child in my own arms. I know that sounds a bit strange, but then when you see yourself as a vulnerable being, you can actually be kind to yourself. The point of it is that I think that I must build this building one day. I will build this building one day because I wouldn't mind being that old gentleman showing people how to be more compassionate to each other. Thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you will certainly have opportunities to put some questions to Bruce. What I suggest we might do is blend that in with the next component of the afternoon, which will be the round table session. So if those of us here who are here to be participants in the discussion could start making your way towards the front of the stage, that'd be great. And Bruce will be part of that round table, so we really do encourage people to be putting questions. And I'm sure you will have many, many questions. Just an extraordinary array of creativity there. And I really did love the tents. I mean, I thought all of them were fantastic, but extremely interesting perceptions of creativity, which will be, in fact, a theme that we're going to be exploring now. On that, Texas Tech has recently established a new unit on campus. It is called the Creative Process Commons, and it has a very interesting role and intent. But rather than my attempting to explain it, I'm going to ask Andy Wilkinson to step up and do so. Andy, as many of you will know, is the resident artist at the Southwest Collection here at Texas Tech, the libraries. But he is also chair of the Creative Process Commons. So, Andy, if you'd like to do an introduction to your unit and the round table. Thanks.